Wait, was it my turn to bring the snacks or the music? I can never keep track of all these parties we keep having.
I vote music.
Okay, I vote music. You know I have good taste.
The heaviest, blackest metal.
Yeah, I was just telling Leilani that Soilwork just earlier this morning released a 16-minute song with a little mini video to accompany it.
Ooh,
So for
I
you
love
fans of
Soilwork.
Soilwork, it's a Wisp of the Atlantic is the name of the song.
Cool. I will look that up later.
Ooh. Okay, how are we doing on people? So Kenzie's here, Maddie's here, Kelly, Brian, Miriam, Dave, Francine, Carly, Julie, Ashton, Hannah, Juliana, Mikhaili, Maddie, and Stephanie. Okay. By joining, you're giving consent for this to be recorded. I hope you guys knew what you were getting yourselves in for. That didn't really change much. Okay. So what questions do you guys have? We're now headed into the last week of the course. Yeah. Yeah, Monday and Wednesday are our last two class periods. So what questions do you all have? Okay, people like, none. Yeah, it's because Kelly and I are so very clear. Okay, Kelly, can you see my lecture notes?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So in terms of forensic psychology, where I've spent most of my time in one chunk is in clinical forensics. This is doing psychotherapy in jails and in prisons. And so one of the things we get to wonder is what should the goal of psychotherapy be in jails and prisons? Now, there are three possibilities, as you can see listed here on my notes. So treatment of addiction and mental illness because they cause human suffering. Okay, this is the most beneficent and pro-social of the motivations to allow and to facilitate psychotherapy in prisons. That there is a very strange notion that, especially if you're a psychotherapist, that you are called upon to do good for its own sake. That's a little bit of a foreign way of thinking to many American minds, where they want to be told what they will get out of doing a thing, that any and all actions need to be benefiting of the self in order for the action to be engaged in and undertaken. Okay, so there are those, though, who say that even if it comes at a cost, facilitating human welfare is worth some sacrifice, and some would argue even an ultimate sacrifice. So therefore, treatment in prisons and jails should be offered because there are people suffering in prisons and jails, and that suffering is perpetuated in those settings and outside. Now, you'll notice that one of the key features of this particular mindset is indifference to praise and blame. Okay, so what that means is to do good for people regardless of whether or not they are good people in the eyes of a given society. Like the other day, for example, bit of a hardcore, ooh, the still and cat back exhaust system is in. All right. So when one of my clients the other day shared her autobiography in group therapy. This is something that all the clients are assigned to do in the 90 days they're in treatment with us, is they share their autobiography. And one client shared her autobiography, which entailed a pretty brutal sexual assault. one of the men in group who feels caring and protective of the young lady who shared that part of her story. He says, I want to take that mother bleeper and I want to sodomize him with a broom leads to show him what it's like. And the young lady who shared her auto started to tear up, and she says, as somebody who has been raped, I don't want anybody to be raped, not even my rapist. All it does is create more suffering in the world. And it really threw her protective male counterpart in group for a loop. He had not thought of it that way. He's like, her whole response is, what happened to her is not okay, but sexually assaulting those who sexual assault only increases the amount of sexual assault in the world. That it's not about people getting the suffering that they deserve. It's about trying to ameliorate suffering, including the suffering of those who are suffering so much that they do evil things. So in working in prison, I found a stellar example of this possibility one. And that was in Sister Mary Ruth. So Sister Mary Ruth, a nun, Catholic, had a dream of Jesus, and he told her that to take scripture literally and to go work in jails and prisons. And she did. She got what's called a modification to her vows and was able to go and get a doctorate degree. I think she got her doctorate degree at Purdue in clinical psychology. And she works for the prisons 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And she goes home to the nunnery, and her whole paychecks just go to the convent. And not only is she one of the most profoundly talented psychotherapists I've ever met, she was a force for good, well, still is a force for good in the world. I'm extremely fond of Sister Mary Ruth. I learned so much from her. And so what I found more commonly, though, Sister Mary Ruth being an obvious exception to these other two, but in many jails and prisons where I've worked, the treatment, psychotherapy is allowed, tolerated, or even encouraged for the sake of number two, and that is to facilitate the smooth functioning of a prison. Smart prison administrators have found that when you get therapists involved, there are fewer disruptions, stabbings, suicide attempts, fights, etc. All these dramatic things that create a lot of paperwork and unnecessary hassle for the guards and for the administrators. So therefore, they either tolerate or actively encourage psychotherapy for the prisoners because it decreases the amount of work, unnecessary work, that the administrators and law enforcement professionals in those settings have to do. The third is unfortunately also heartbreakingly common, and that is the application and enforcement of retributive and norm enforcing practices. Okay? It was painful to see how many of my colleagues, about half of them, took up this one goal of psychotherapy. So one day, for example, a colleague of mine couldn't be found, and he was assigned to work L house. L is in Larry, okay? And so I was on my lunch break eating a sandwich with one hand and madly taking case notes with the other. And Sister Mary Ruth says, Matt, Dr. So-and-so of L House has gone missing. There's a crisis. Would you please go and handle it? And so I drop my sandwich and run across the yard. And in nameless doctor's office, there was a client sitting there. He's in his prison browns. He's got long black hair over his face, not making eye contact. I come in and try to talk to him, and he just described in a dead monotone the plans, means, and intent he had to complete suicide. And so I verified and re-verified with him. And just as I got him sent off to medical, Dr. Nameless came in and sat down, and he says, you fell for it. And I went, fell for what? And he goes, that guy, I've known him now for 3 years. He just played you like a fiddle, you dummy. And I said, what do you mean, played me? He said, he's not going to kill himself. And I said, what makes you so certain? And he says, I've known this guy for 3 years. I said, you didn't answer my question. Time alone does not give certainty. Well, and he goes, okay, so that guy that you just sent to medical, he's got a roommate, and he's been trying to get away from his roommate. You and I would say cellmate. He's been trying to get away from his roommate now for 3 years because his roommate, anytime his roommate is horny, he fucks him. and he rapes him. Not, by the way, Nameless did not use the word rape. He used the word fucks. And I went, wait a minute. So his cellmate is raping him. No wonder he's suicidal. And he goes, yeah, but he's been suicidal for 3 years. And I'm like, yeah, if I had a very large cellmate raping me anytime he wanted to, I think that might make me suicidal. And he goes, he's not going to do it. You just wasted my time. You wasted medical's time. You just need to get with the program, Draper. And I said, what program is that, Dr. Nameless? He says, these are bad guys. Part of our job is to teach them the consequences of being bad guys. And then maybe when they'll get out, they won't be bad guys anymore. And I went, Dr. Nameless, are you saying that by allowing and tolerating rape in a cell block on your watch, that's going to help straighten these guys out and make them better citizens? And at that point, he started yelling at me to get out of his office. Okay. So I found that unfortunately common, that there wasn't the goal to ameliorate suffering, because suffering is itself is a problem and amelioration is itself a good, but instead, if anything, to perpetuate suffering, to use very behaviorist, very punishment-oriented therapy techniques to dissuade antisocial behaviors.
We have a question from Madeline.
For Maddie?
Yeah, it's actually more of a comment, I guess I would say. I just rewatched 13th the other day for one of the critical reviews, and they made a really good point that I had missed previously when I watched it. And they said that oftentimes, most often, jails and prisons are put there to restrict freedom, obviously, for a certain amount of time in order for that to be like justice for whoever was on the receiving end of a crime. But what prisons aren't supposed to do is to physically punish inmates, which is what most often happens. And most guards mistake the purpose of a prison system, and they believe that it is their role in society to punish prisoners. But that's not the point of a prison. And they'd worded it much better than I had, but I thought it was a really great point that it was just like a phrase that I had missed previously, but it was impactful on me.
Yeah. And so imagine, Maddie, how troubling it is when treatment professionals, doctors, nurses, therapists, also believe it's their job to punish. You know what I mean? It's grossly disheartening. In fact, okay. So I'm going to do you guys a solid. You've stuck with me all semester. It's been a long semester. No, who am I fooling? It's been an extremely short semester for me. But reinforcement is 10 times more powerful in modifying behavior than punishment is. Okay, let me say that again. Reinforcement is 10 times more powerful in modifying behavior than punishment is. Now, if you live in a world with just reinforcement, then reinforcement has no power. If you live in a world with just punishment, punishment doesn't have any power. The secret is to have both at your disposal and to freely utilize both, but at the ratio of 9 to 1. Okay, 9 times more reinforcers to every one punisher. Okay, so therefore, this goes to how you will raise your children. If you think about it, somebody's saying, I'm not raising my child in a prison. Great, strongly encouraged. And I don't want you to turn your home into a prison. But what I mean is that when you raise your kids with affection and praise, etc., and that is far more common than the time you swat their little butts and send them to your room, the children's behavior will conform more strongly to what it is that you desire, hopefully pro-social rather than antisocial behavior from them. Likewise, this goes for working in an addictions clinic. This works for working in a prison. That reinforcement, when it is far more common than punishment, behavior is more strongly modified. Sister Mary Ruth, the prisoners would fight over, because anytime she was assigned to a cell block, the amount of antisocial behavior would go way down. Why? Sister Mary Ruth doesn't know about the statistic of 9 to 1. Sister Mary Ruth is just genuinely a Christ-like human being, and wherever she goes, she tends to be very reinforcing. She tends to be very kind, very compassionate. And when 5 foot tall, 90-pound Sister Mary Ruth gets mad at you and you're a client, you fucked up. Like, that you're in trouble with God, right? If Sister Mary Ruth gets mad at you. So therefore, her anger modified behavior as well, but only in the face of the fact that 90% of the time she was so incredibly warm and incredibly kind, right? I'm hoping this makes sense to some of you. And so therefore, Dr. Nameless, his cell house was a train wreck. That cell house had more rapes, more assaults, more suicide attempts, more homicide threats, more florid people acting out due to florid psychoses than the other houses, because his ratio was 10 punishments to 0 reinforcers, right? He thought that punishment was the way to change human behavior. Now, between you and I, if you meet a parent whose philosophy of teaching is punishment first, last, and always, that's what we call in the therapy field an abusive parent, okay? And so I would argue he's being an abusive therapist. What's even more darkly ironic to me is when Correctional Health Services lost the contract with the state of Indiana and Prison Health Services won the contract. They laid off 90% of us therapists. Thank goodness they didn't lay off Sister Mary Ruth, and they also did not lay off Dr. Nameless. And so it's been really fun because there's a wall that goes through the middle of the prison between one set of cell blocks and another set of cell blocks. The set of cell blocks that Sister Mary Ruth is in charge of and does her work with has far fewer assaults, etc., than the other half that Dr. Nameless is in charge of. Okay, so thank you very much, Maddie. That is such a good point. That it's not, once they're in prison, it's not our job to keep heaping punishments upon them. Well, being in prison is not so bad. Yes, it is. I can't tell you how many people I've known personally decompensated when they were told they had to stay home for 2 weeks, wear a mask, socially distance, right? Yeah, prison's as bad as it sounds. Okay. So each of these possibilities has their own implications. So when you treat suffering for its own sake, right? When you encounter other people as human, whether they're prisoners or guards or administrators, they're all equally, then the implication is that it is actually the prisoner that is the client, okay? Meaning that if I'm meeting with Mr. Jones, who's currently housed in G House, that he is my client and that I would have the same compassionate relationship with him, meeting him where he's at, that I would in the local community clinic. And so the goal is to look for sources of stress in a remarkably stressful system and ameliorate those. One of the things that got Sister Mary Ruth and I and Dr. Huffy in, I don't want to use the word trouble, because it wasn't like formal getting written up and our jobs being threatened, but constant tension with the system, is there are ways that a therapist can advise a toxic system on how to be less toxic for everybody's benefit. By the way, Lieutenant Lovejoy, I hope you're like a colonel now or something, but one of the officers I got to work with in administrative segregation, you guys have heard some horror stories of ASEG, was Lieutenant Lovejoy. He was promoted into that role from another prison. He was actually moved to Wabash Valley. And when I met with Lovejoy, even though his officers would give him pushback, and I made suggestions on slight systemic changes that would, in the long run, decrease problems, he listened and took it very seriously and put those in application because he had worked directly with directly with therapists at his other prison and had found it to be very effective. Plus, Lovejoy was oddly humanistic for somebody in such a grossly humane system. Not to say he was proactively kind, but there was still a little bit of milk of human kindness that flowed through his veins. So Lovejoy, wherever you're at, love you, bro. I haven't seen him in years. So, like, one of the practices that was standard operating procedure is the trays go out, meaning trays of food, breakfast, lunch, or dinner. They go out to the cell blocks at a certain time. Those trays are collected at a certain time. If the tray still has food on it when it is collected, regardless of the quantity of food, that food is thrown away. And so I had a client, for example, who suffered from insomnia, and he was afraid of the dark, etc. And that prison wing could get really dark. So he was traumatized. He was sexually abused a lot by his older cousins, but they would wait until it was pitch black before they would sexually victimize him. So that way nobody could see what they were doing. So now that he's in the prison and it gets pitch black in the prison, he would often be up all night and sleep all day. And he was started starving to death. Okay. And so one of the things that I had arranged was a simple practice of when they lay the tray in the door, that they bang on the plate steel door. So in this particular prison, they didn't have bars, they had plate steel doors. And about crotch level, there was a turn and pull door that you could pull down made out of heavy plate steel. And when it pulled it down between the thickness of the door and the thickness of the plate, it actually formed like a small tray unto itself that you could balance a food tray on. And so I just said, can we just put it into practice that you bang on the doors if you don't see that the client is awake? And so they started doing that. My guy started gaining weight again. Well, not that he was ever overweight, but he started putting healthy weight back on. And when he started putting healthy weight back on, he was less of a jerk, right? And therefore it decreased the officer's stress level because they've got one less jerk to work with. Well, it turned out that there were a bunch of men in ASAG, especially some of our more severely mentally ill men, who needed reminders to eat. I hope I told you guys the Dr. Ass story early in the semester. Does that sound familiar? Kelly, does that ring a bell?
Yes, you did talk
Dr.
about
Ass.
Dr. Ass.
Excellent. So there was a client who really needed his nutrition, but needed reminders to eat. And turns out not just from the guard, but from his fellow prisoners. So one of the things that's very controversial from other points of view is number 5, and that is soliciting feedback from the clients about what works for them and what doesn't. That's a very odd thing to do. And I don't mean in terms of being locked up. Hey, what about prison doesn't work for you? No, that's a silly question. Instead, it's okay, what in our therapy, in therapy you've had before, if you've had therapy, what helps and what doesn't? Like, you take the client's viewpoints that seriously. Then number 6, advocating for clients with prison guards and administrators. So one of the things that Sister Mary Ruth, Dr. Huffy, and myself were regularly accused of is off love. Okay, it's spelled OFFLUV. Off love was the pejorative from those guards and those administrators of being an offender lover, meaning that many of the guards and some of the administrators had an us versus them mentality. And so if you showed any kindness or any regard for the other side, then you were against them. So if I go to a meeting of prison guards and I'm advocating for the needs of a particular prisoner, some of those guards will now see me as against guards and pro offender, so an offender lover, an off love. Okay, and so it was really tricky and often greatly disheartening to be an advocate for the prisoners with the guards and administrators. It's one of the things that made that job extremely stressful. So I remember, oh boy. So I got a call to D House that one of my guys was decompensating. He was suffering from a psychotic break, a sudden acute psychotic break. And so I'm talking to Jonesy, who's the pod officer. So what that means is in some prisons you have a central pod. Imagine there's 2 stories of cells kind of going out from the sides view in a U shape and out to in front of you, right? And you're on the second story in a glass walled office with all the controls for all of the cells, and you can see everything going on from the floor of the prison, the rec yard, all the way up in every cell, first and second floor. That's called the pod. Okay, and Jonesy was the pod officer, and he calls because he can see one of my guys melting down, and my guy was beating his head against the wall and splitting his head open, so there was blood starting to splatter against the wall. So I go running over there with a couple of nurses, and I get the guy out. And in the time it took me to calm my guy down enough to get him out of the cell, there's only one room in that entire cell block where we can meet with our clients. And it's called a multi-purpose room. And it's a little L-shaped room that is as big as Well, two of these lazy boys facing each other at an angle, right? It's a very small room. And so I go to that multi-purpose room, and as I'm opening it up, who's in there but Jonesy? He's got a big old Dagwood sandwich in one hand and a confiscated pornographic magazine in the other hand. He's got his feet up on the little desk. And I go, Jonesy, can I please use this space? Jonesy takes a big ass bite of that Dagwood sandwich and chewing with his mouth open, cow style, he goes, I'm on my break. You'll just have to fucking wait. Off, love, right? It's a big double bird to me. And so I've got a guy bleeding out his face, blood's trickling down his prison browns, etc. The nurses are trying to stop the bleeding. We need a place to get him to lay down. And I have to take 5 extra minutes to convince Jonesy to let me use the space reserved for me and for him to finish his lunch up in his pod. 5 minutes of unnecessary blood loss. You know what I mean? It's like, that was the most working with men in prison was easy. It was dealing with guards and administrators that was so extremely difficult. So the other thing you do is you seek for resources in a resource impoverished setting. In our society, we believe that people in prison are bad people, and therefore we're okay that bad things happen to them, and we don't want to spend any money on them as a society. So therefore, the setting is resource impoverished. So if I've got clients that need clothes or a coat or shoes, all of these things are things that the prison by policy should be applying and doesn't. Trying to get a modification to a client's to his redirection so he can still access his college classes. So okay, let's say you and I are in prison and I say something about your mom and you deck me, you just start punching me in the head. When the guards come, we both go to segregation, right? They don't care who started the fight. In fact, you could be laying on the ground bleeding, having never thrown a punch, and you'll still go to segregation, right? And so therefore, it became up to therapists, ironically enough, to be Sherlock Holmes, to detective out from multiple points of view what happened, as well as to the CCTV footage to show that the victim was a victim and not a fellow aggressor, and therefore could they please have modifications to their segregation so they can still attend college classes, for example. Like, that's one example of many. And then, of course, number 8 is looking to innovate new therapeutic practices. One of the innovations that I really appreciated is Sister Mary Ruth found a way to lead group therapy in solitary confinement. And so what she did is she had an empty storage room, and she personally, I found out later, even though this woman's like, 60, there was a whole bunch of chairs that were stored in that room for big meetings within the prison. So for like the guards and administrators. And so she stacked the chairs up floor to ceiling around that room, and it created a large space in the middle. She then worked with the guards to have these little phone booth size, if you guys are old enough to remember what telephone booths are, but these little telephone booth size mini cells in that room, to have 6 of those. She would sit in the middle. The men would be brought in individually, shackled, hand behind them, feet shackled together, and then their hands shackled to their feet. So they would shuffle in, they'd be sat down in those mini cells, they'd be unshackled in the sense of unshackling their hands from their feet, but their hands and feet remain shackled, because this is segregation, right? These guys are the most hardcore. Who even has this number? And so what she would do is she would do group therapy. So she sat in a swiveling stool in the middle of those 6 cells, and she would facilitate the men processing things together. It was a genius invention. It took a lot of arguing and a lot of cajoling and some bribery. My beloved makes these cinnamon rolls that are worth dying for. So there's like 2 that the prison administrators really liked. One was her bacon cinnamon rolls, where she lays out the big old flat cinnamon roll dough. She puts in the cinnamon and sugar, and then she would take maple smoked bacon that she had fried herself, crunch it up into like 1/4 inch size pieces, and gently layer those in with cinnamon and sugar. Roll that up, cut the slices into the rolls, and then she would layer, after they were baked, she would put in maple frosting, her own homemade maple frosting, and would sprinkle little bacon bits on top of that. That went over extremely well with the guards and administrators. And so that's one of the things we used in our meetings, like with fresh pan of these cinnamon rolls, right, to the meetings. And between you and I, prison administrators will listen to you. It doesn't mean they will agree with you, but they will at least stop and listen when you bring them food they like. Okay, so for those of you who are going to work in prison someday, take note. Hopefully you know somebody who makes really good cinnamon rolls. But, oh, by the way, the other kind they're actually chocolate cinnamon rolls, where she doesn't put chocolate in the bread dough, but she actually uses cocoa and cocoa sugar rather than cinnamon. And then she adds crushed cacao nib to it. And then when she rolls up the cinnamon roll, she puts chocolate frosting on the top and then adds the crunchy cacao nib on top of that as well. That one went over great. And that's how we actually got new shower services in BSEG. Okay, so you do what you can to try to advocate for more resources and innovating new therapeutic practices, because resources and new practices often go together. So if it is your job to instead keep the prison running smoothly, and that's why you're a prison therapist, then it's really the prison administration is your client. And prisoners are bad guys who need to be controlled and who manipulate to get what they want. Okay, and so it becomes the job of psych, those of us doing mental health work in prisons, to detect and foil attempts at manipulation. And anything is an attempt at manipulation, right? It's really kind of heartbreaking and troubling that imagine living in a world where anything you say is always already taken up as an attempt to get one over on someone else, right? You're a bad guy, and therefore everything you say is bad or intended to get gain by harming. So you foil their attempts at manipulation. I learned from my colleagues, like, well, Dr. Nameless was more number 3, but Salamanca, for example, was another psychologist, and it's you reward good behavior and you punish bad behavior. So you find sources of behavioral disruption and you create rules against those, and you rearrange prisoners as needed. So one of the things, for example, is gambling became strictly forbidden in prison because of the efforts of psych. Okay, that there would be interpersonal conflict, contention that would create a lot more anxiety and depression in the prison. That would also create more antisocial behaviors and acting out. And so they found that at the root of it all was gambling. And it doesn't matter if they were gambling matchsticks, or in our prison, they gambled soups. Okay. And so cup of noodle soups, like if you walked into a man's cell and he had stacks of cups of noodle soup, he was an extremely wealthy person, because that was the currency. And so sometimes people would bet more than they had, and then they would be under threat of violence for those people they owed money to because of their bet. It's called welch on a bet. Welching is, let's say I bet Maddie $10 I don't have that the Packers are going to win a game. Okay, well, the Packers lose the game. I now owe Maddie $10. If I don't have those $10 and I don't pay her, that's welching on a bet. And that's considered justification for violence, where Maddie can come at me with a fist or with a knife. Maddie, please don't beat me up or stab me. I'll pay you, I promise. Okay. So what these therapists do is they're very rule oriented. It intrigues me that they believe that rules change behavior. And when in meetings with them, I would point out, if rules changed behavior, we wouldn't need prison. The reason we have this prison is because these people did things that are against the rules. Why do you think rules are going to change behavior? It's shockingly naive. Okay. So the other thing that I found with these therapists, so the type 1 therapists like Sister Mary Ruth, if there was conflict in a cell, Sister Mary Ruth would go into that cell and basically do couples counseling with those two men. my colleagues like Salamanca, who were really interested in the second purpose, would instead just arrange people. Oh, these two people are fighting. That's a problem. So I'm going to swap this person's cell for this person's cell, etc. Okay. And then these folks tend to collaborate with administration to improve the flow of prisoners throughout the day and help minimize the amount of oversight they require when not moving. So there were certain of my colleagues in psych who weren't off love, right? They weren't offender lovers, that they were on the administration side and the administration knew it. But they had a very impersonal relationship with the men in prison. They might have personal relationships, collegial friendships, et cetera, with the administrators and guards, but they were clearly on their side. And so therefore they were more listened to, because when that psychologist comes in and says, here's how we can improve flow, the administrators go, oh, we know you're on our side, so therefore let's do that. Okay. So then people like Dr. Nameless, and by the way, the reason I call him Dr. Nameless is, as good as I am with names, I cannot remember that sumbitch's name. Like, to this day, I worked with him for, 2.5 years, and I can't remember his name. I can describe him in detail. Give me an FBI sketch artist, I will give you a photographic representation of the man, but I'm so disgusted by him, I can't even remember his name. Okay, so Dr. Nameless. Society is the client. Like, he would regularly talk about his justification for doing what he was doing as a psychologist in prison is in the name of society. So the prisoners are antisocial and need to be conditioned not to misbehave when released. And Dr. Nameless's favorite form of conditioning, as I'm sure you guys have guessed, is punishment. So prisoners are bad guys who, quote, need to be taught a lesson, and it's up to psych to help teach that lesson, really drive that lesson home. And so punitive enforcement of social norms. You either do this or we'll hurt you, meaning we'll take away privileges, we'll take away rights, we'll take away anything we can do if you don't conform to what it is that we want. And so one of the things that we observe, and this is something like in Plizzi's book and in the book he and I co-authored that you guys read, is there's a tendency to dehumanize the dehumanizers, meaning that many of the men, especially those guilty of sexual crimes or violent crimes, dehumanize their victims in order to victimize them. And so to my colleagues who believe in this third purpose of psychotherapy in prison would then be, okay, well, they're bad and they dehumanize people, so let's show them what it's like by dehumanizing them. And it didn't matter how many times me and Huffy and Mary Ruth would say, you're helping them become better at dehumanizing, right? They're good at it already, and now you practicing it on them is renormalizing it, right? It renorms it. It shows them even more techniques on how to dehumanize other people. You're dehumanizing the dehumanizers, and you're helping them get better at it. Nameless and his colleagues couldn't see it. It's like that part of their brain was missing. So they use norm-based therapies to mold or shape prisoners into someone, quote, more normal. Okay. This is one I'm somewhat sympathetic for, or somewhat sympathetic towards. And that is that, okay, let's use the therapies that we know and use the therapies that are, best practices and empirically guided treatments, et cetera. But the goal isn't the welfare of the client. The goal is the welfare of society by getting a more normal person out of prison, right? That when they're released, they act more normal. Okay, that can actually be somewhat of a beneficent motive for society, or in the name of society to accomplish. The concern, though, is very few of my men, when released from prison, entered anything that the therapists considered a normal world. Okay, they didn't share the backgrounds that these men have. They come from usually upper middle class white society. They don't come from lower class Latino or lower class African American or homeless, right? They don't know what it's like. And many of my clients would be released straight onto the street with nowhere to live and nowhere to go. So you think you're going to help these men be more normal, but your definition of normal doesn't even apply to their world. You're not helping them. Okay, I could go on rants for hours about this. Let me move on. Self-restraint. Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that I'm learning that. So as you see, 6 and 7 go hand in hand. The presumption is that prisoners are not situated within a context of oppression and poverty upon release, and you can pretend to yourself that your cognitive behavioral therapy programs make a difference. CBT works great on highly motivated, white, rich people who want it to work. It doesn't work at all on other groups and populations who are indifferent to it working. Okay. So CBT is usually the best practice in therapy. Drives me up a wall. Okay. The first is the overarching goal for therapy, and it colors the other two in a more beneficent way. That there are ways to have the prisoner in question be the client, to look to overall reduce the amount of suffering for that individual client, as well as the system, the prison system within which they find themselves. And so you can help the prison run more smoothly, and you can look out for the needs of society, interestingly enough, by being humane to the prisoner and maybe even, heaven forbid, being kind to them. Okay. So you can collaborate with administration to facilitate the well-being of the prisoner, who is the client, right, from this model. What facilitates the smooth running of the prison is often, but not always, also that which facilitates the best interest of the client, right? They're not mutually exclusive very often. And so you can also look to the needs of society by validating and practicing humanity with the dehumanized. So Sister Mary Ruth's been a prison psychologist now for 20 years. 25 years. Yeah, it's 2020, right? Yeah, she started in 1995. She's never been assaulted in prison. And some of you say, okay, well, she's a woman. Right, that usually increases risk in prison, not decreases it. And she's tiny. She's like 4'11", 5 foot maybe, and skinny. And I mean, she just doesn't take up much physical space. Her spiritual space is large, like she can fill a room, but she's tiny, right? And that would also increase risk of victimization. And so then I look at Huffy. Huffy worked in prisons for what, 10 years? Before he's a professor now at Southern Utah University. And he was never assaulted. Now, don't get me wrong, there were clients who, through florid psychoses, etc., would speak very violently at him as part of their delusion. But he was, in general, treated with a great deal of respect. And so was I. Like, one of the things they really drill into you when you go to your training as you're going to become a prison psychologist, they really drill into you can't trust these men. These men are sharks, they're predators, they're out to get you, they only care about themselves. Like, those things will be drilled into you. And on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, it's true only for a significant minority of the men in prison. Like, yeah, when you're walking across the yard during rec, when the cell yard is full, you don't just walk around clueless, right? You're aware of who you're around, you're aware of what you're doing and what it means. Okay. But you don't have to be hyper vigilant about it. Back when I taught self-defense classes, we talked about the color code, the awareness code. So there's condition white, clueless, assuming there's no harm possible, in prison, we called these people free meat, right? Just the really clueless, not paying attention to where they are or what they're going or who they're with. Okay. Condition yellow is an awareness of who's around you, what you're doing, and what this means, what they're doing, and what that means. Condition orange is when there's a possibility for threat and you're starting to look for threat actively. And then condition red is the threat has presented itself and you know exactly where the threat is and you're endeavoring to respond by fighting or fleeing. Okay, so white, yellow, orange, red. One of the things that when it was my turn to train new therapists, I taught them condition yellow. You don't need to be hypervigilant scanning condition orange or condition red all the time, assuming that everybody there is out to murder you or rape you. Instead, be very aware of who you're with, who you're talking to, how you're talking to them, etc., and remain respectful while you do it. So the people that I trained who would do that had far fewer problems in the prison. Those who ran on condition orange and condition red, by being so aggressively hyper aware, ended up creating more problems than they solved. Okay. So it turned out not all the guys in prison are out to get you or to hurt you to get gain at your expense. Some are. But by remaining in condition yellow, of being very aware of the context of where you're at, you begin to get a pretty good sense of who you can trust and to what degree. Another mindset I would encourage you to adopt if you're working addictions, if you're working in prisons, etc. It's what's called open skepticism. Okay, open skepticism is the mindset that as a client is telling you something, no, Dr. Draper, I didn't start that fight, or no, Dr. Draper, the marijuana found in my cell is not mine, right? Open. Maybe they're telling the truth, right? To really hear them out and to really go, okay, help me understand and meet them that way. And at the same time, skeptical that they could be lying, right? That maybe it's a very different story at hand than the one they're telling you. So it's openness and skepticism together. And that sounds like two very cognitive dissonant stress yourself out. No. The sign of an intelligent human being is they can hold two contradictory ideas in their head as possible at the same time, right? That you can be totally open to. Maybe he was framed. That is entirely possible. And maybe he's lying. That's entirely possible too, because it allows you to be sensitive to both sets of possibilities, okay? So for those of you who are going to work in prison, remember condition yellow. Don't be clueless, right? Be gently aware of who you're with, what you're doing, what it means, where you're going, right? Just have a gentle awareness of your environment and be skeptically open and openly skeptical, okay? That you hear them out, you're really engaged with them, meeting where they're at, and at the same time, do so where if there are flaws or flaws in their story or contradictions, you'll be the first one aware and can bring it to their attention. Okay. So what we will do on Monday is start talking about prison culture and psychotherapy. And then we will probably finish up this unit, and then we will get into how to assess sex offenders, how to be a forensic evaluator for sex offenders. So any questions in closing today, my colleagues? Nope, crystal clear. Well, I hope you enjoyed my podcast today on working in a prison, and we will see you all on Monday. Kelly, I'm going to shoot you a Marco Polo here in just a minute, okay? So see you all later, guys. Bye-bye.